Welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. It means more than you know to have you here again. Life has its weight, its wonders, and everything in between. I hope today gave you at least a little light. Wherever you're watching from, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment, share a piece of your day. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. We're building something real here, together. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever wished you could just disappear and no one would even notice? Lucas Harlan had lost everything. Broken by grief after his wife's death, he returned to an old forest cabin once owned by his grandfather, carrying nothing but the weight of his sorrow and a quiet plan to end it all. But something stopped him. Not a person, not a voice, a creature. Old, massive, gentle. A Bigfoot fading with time. Long forgotten by the world, yet guarding the soul of the forest. No one believed it existed. No one knew it still watched, still cared. And in this unexpected bond, a man shattered by loss began to rediscover what it truly means to be alive, inspired by real legends from the mountains of Oregon and stories passed down for generations. This is not just a tale of survival. It's one of healing, memory, and love in the most unexpected form. This is his story. I was 38 the first time I returned to Hollow Creek in over 2 decades, and I wasn't there to make peace with the past. I brought one duffel bag, a box of old photos, and a revolver wrapped in a kitchen towel. I wasn't going to shoot myself. That would have been too loud. I just wanted to disappear, quietly, the way grief eats at you and no one's watching. Mara had been gone for 3 years. A drunk driver, a night that shattered what little softness I had left. After she died, everything went colorless. People offered casseroles and condolences and all the other useless things people offer when they can't fix a damn thing. So I sold the house, quit the job, and drove until the road turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to silence. The only place left that knew me before everything fell apart was the cabin. My grandfather Eldon built it in the 60s with his own hands. He was the kind of man who believed in ghosts, God, and giants, in that order. As a kid, I used to visit him, and every summer he'd take me fishing, show me how to track elk, and at night, when the fire popped and the wind slid under the door, he'd tell me stories about a giant that lived in the woods. Not a monster, not the horror movie kind. He ain't here to hurt nobody, Grandpa would say. He just remembers more than he wants to. I thought it was a story, just something to make the trees seem less empty. But the night before he died of a stroke, he called me, said one sentence, "He's still waiting out there," then hung up. I never forgot that, not even after I buried him. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, half swallowed by moss and silence. It leaned a little to the left, like it was tired of standing upright. The dock was still there, but the rowboat was gone, swallowed by years of storms. I hauled my gear up the hill alone. Daisy, my German shepherd, stuck close. She was the only thing I'd kept after Mara rescued her the day I buried the urn. She didn't bark, she didn't wag, but she stayed. That's all I needed. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar, ash, and something faintly sweet, like dried sage. The fireplace was intact. The lanterns still worked. I swept the floor, unpacked my few things, and sat in the same rocking chair Grandpa used to sit in. The silence settled in like an old friend. But that first night, something felt off, not dangerous. Just seen. It started with the steps behind the cabin, soft at first, too heavy for a deer, too slow for a bear. Daisy stiffened, her ears perked, but she didn't growl. Instead, she looked at me like I should already know what it was. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the back porch, but there was nothing there. Just the trees breathing in the dark. Then I saw it, on the railing. A single bundle of dried flowers tied with a strip of cloth, checkered, old, maybe from a shirt. Not native wildflowers either, These were the kind that only bloomed down near the lower valley in spring. Someone, or something, had walked them all the way up here. I stood there for a long time, flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't take the flowers. I just left them there. It felt like taking them would have broken something. The next morning, I found more signs. The storage shed door was slightly ajar, though I'd locked it the night before. Nothing was missing, but one thing had moved. A carved wooden whistle, shaped like a raven. The same one Grandpa gave me when I was 8, sat dead center on the step. That whistle had burned up in the cabin fire when I was 16. I never saw it again. Until now. I didn't breathe for almost a full minute, just stared. The wood was darkened by age, but the same scratch behind the beak, the initials, Eldon Harlan, were still carved underneath. I reached out and touched it like it might vanish if I moved too fast. It didn't vanish. It was real. And someone had brought it back to me. That night Daisy wouldn't leave the fireplace. She lay curled but alert, eyes locked on the window facing the tree line. I sat on the floor beside her, the whistle in my palm, and waited for the wind to rise. It never did. Just stillness. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not steps this time. Just a sound. Low, long, like a breath stretched into something melodic. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was familiar. Almost like a memory that hadn't been mine. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched the trees sway against the dark, and every now and then, I swore I saw movement. Not running, not stalking. Just presence. A shape too large to be a man. A weight in the air, thick enough to taste. By dawn, I knew I wasn't alone out here. And not in the way most people fear. It wasn't dread I felt. It was something quieter. Something that whispered maybe I hadn't come back to die after all. Maybe I'd come back to remember. And something out there, watching from the pines, was remembering me too. The morning after the flowers and the whistle, I woke up before the sun rose. The cabin was cold, but not from weather. It was a different kind of cold. The kind that settles into you when something shifts, even if you can't name it yet. Daisy had slept at the foot of the bed but was already up, sitting at the front window with her ears pointed straight. Her eyes didn't blink, just locked on the tree line like it had whispered something only she could hear. I poured stale coffee into a dented tin cup and stood beside her. The trees were still. Too still. No birdsong, no wind, just that kind of unnatural quiet that always seems to come before something breaks. I thought maybe a cougar was nearby. They pass through sometimes, follow the water and vanish like ghosts. But this wasn't that. I could feel it. Daisy could feel it. It wasn't danger exactly. It was presence. The rest of the day I tried to talk myself out of it. I cleared brush around the shed, split some wood, checked the bear traps even though I hadn't set any in years. Just busy work, the pointless things you do when you're trying to ignore the fact that something in the air feels wrong. But I couldn't stop thinking about the whistle, the flowers, the way Daisy wouldn't step off the porch all day. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the dock to check the old boat launch. The planks were warped, soft in the middle. One cracked under my weight. I didn't care. I just needed to move. Needed to breathe somewhere else for a few minutes. I scanned the water, expecting maybe to see a moose on the far bank or a log that looked like one. But what I saw stopped me. Across the lake, right where the trees formed a thick wall, something moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't duck or run or disappear like an animal would. It just stood there, upright, wide, still. My breath caught. The sun was dipping low behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the surface. And whatever this was, its shadow reached all the way to me. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. I never got a clear look. Just a sense of weight, of scale. Shoulders too wide. A head too high. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just trees. Just empty, whispering trees. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. Not for the first time. Maybe not even just recently. Maybe for years, decades. I lit the lanterns early, double-checked the locks, even though I knew damn well no lock could stop something like that. Not if it wanted to come in. Daisy wouldn't eat, just paced the doorway with her hackles up and her tail low. And then came the sound. It started just after midnight, a low vibration that came not from outside, but through the walls, like someone dragging a massive branch across the cabin's outer edge. It circled once. Then silence. My breath sat frozen in my chest. I wanted to believe it was wind, some strange echo through the trees. But there was no wind. The trees weren't moving. The air was still dead. A soft thud hit the porch. Daisy barked once, sharp and guttural. Not like she'd found an intruder, like she'd recognized something she didn't want to remember. I reached for the flashlight, but my hand wouldn't move. I told myself I'd get up, open the door, shine the light, see it was just nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on a man who hadn't slept right in years. But I didn't get up. I couldn't. I sat there in the dark with Daisy at my feet, and the thud still echoing through my ribs. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. The clock ticked. The fire popped. Nothing else moved. I stood and pulled the curtain back. There, on the top step of the porch, were 2 metal storage boxes. Mine. The same 2 boxes I'd lost somewhere between White Pines and the creek trailhead, after the damn side-by-side ran out of gas. I'd written them all, thought maybe a bear dragged them off or some hiker got lucky. But now they were here, closed, unopened. No claw marks, no damage. Just there, returned, placed like offerings. Or reminders. I opened the door just a crack. The cold outside wasn't like cabin cold. It felt alive. Sharp, wet, and watching. I knelt slowly and dragged the first box in. Then the second. Inside was everything I remembered. Blankets, photos, 2 cans of soup, a cassette player, Mara's sweat. But tucked beneath her sweater was something I hadn't packed. A small horse figurine. Worn, metal, bent in the back legs. My grandfather used to carry it in his pocket for luck. I hadn't seen it since his funeral. We thought he'd been buried with it. That broke me. I sat on the cabin floor with that cold piece of metal in my palm. And for the first time since Mara died, I let the tears fall. Not the kind that burst out all at once, but the kind that ache, slow, hot, unstoppable. Someone had returned it. Or something. Whatever it was, it hadn't taken anything. Only given. Only watched. Only waited. The next morning, I went outside before the sun was fully up. The trees were still there, standing tall and hollow and ancient. The air tasted like pine and frost and something else. Like something that had been breathing just over my shoulder, and it stepped back a few feet. I didn't say, "Thank you," but I didn't touch the horse again for a while. I let it sit on the mantel where the firelight could catch it every night. And every time it did, I felt less alone. Not safe, not yet, but seen. It was 3 days after the boxes showed up on my porch that I drove back into town. I hadn't planned on leaving the cabin again so soon, but the propane was lower than I'd remembered, and Daisy had finished the last of the dry food. I told myself I just needed supplies, but the truth was, I needed to step back from the edge. Something about finding my grandfather's old Lucky Charm under Mara's sweater. Something about the quiet logic of it all had started to crack something open inside me. And when things crack, sometimes you need noise. Grocery stores, small talk, fluorescent lights that buzz like they're alive. Something normal, even if it only lasts a half hour. The trip down the gravel road felt longer than usual. Maybe because I kept glancing at the mirror. Not for traffic, for something else. A shape, a shadow. Nothing ever showed up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one using that road lately. The town hadn't changed much. Just a few more boarded windows and one new sandwich shop that already looked like it regretted being there. I picked up what I needed quick: canned chili, batteries, jerky, propane, kibble. And as I passed the register, I saw a crate near the door. 5 German Shepherd pups, all huddled and asleep except for one. She was sitting up, ears high, eyes locked on me like she already knew who I was. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe the way her gaze didn't blink. Maybe the way her head tilted just slightly, like she recognized something in me that I hadn't seen in myself in years. I asked the clerk about her, and he said someone found the litter near the edge of the forest outside Trout Bend. No tags, no mother. The others were spoken for. She wasn't. She came home with me. I named her Daisy on the drive back, and she didn't flinch once the whole way. Just sat on the passenger seat like she'd done it 100 times. When we pulled up to the cabin, she didn't hesitate at the door. She walked straight in like she belonged. Like she remembered. That night, something changed. We were sitting by the fire, the wind tapping the windows just light enough to keep me from relaxing, when Daisy's ears shot up. Not like a normal bark alert, like she'd heard a voice in a language I couldn't understand. She moved to the back door, nose pressed low to the gap under the frame. A moment later, I heard it too. A low, hollow sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a groan. Rose from somewhere deep in the woods. It vibrated in my teeth. It had weight. It didn't sound like a wolf or bear. It was deeper, wetter, as if it had to travel through something old to reach us. It wasn't just sound. It was memory. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared at the back wall like I could see through it. The sound came again, longer this time, then cut off so suddenly it left a vacuum in its place. Daisy didn't bark. She just backed away from the door and sat beside me, her body tense but quiet. She leaned against my leg like she needed confirmation that I was real, that this was real. I ran my hand across her back and felt how fast her heart was beating. Mine matched it. I stayed up long after the fire burned out. At some point, I dozed in the chair, and when I opened my eyes, the room was filled with that thick, early morning haze, the kind that seeps through every window crack and makes the whole cabin feel underwater. Daisy was standing at the window again, but this time, she was growling. I stood slowly and followed her line of sight, and I saw it, not clearly. Just a shape, wide. Too wide, tall. Still, standing between the trees like it had been there all night, like it belonged to the woods more than the trees did. It didn't move, didn't duck or flinch. It just stood there, watching. Daisy's growl dropped to a low rumble, like she couldn't decide whether to protect me or hide. My mouth went dry. My hand reached for the old flashlight hanging by the stove. But I didn't turn it on. I didn't want light. Not yet. Not if it meant seeing the truth too fast. And then it turned. Not fast, not startled. Just slowly. Like it had decided it had seen enough for now. It stepped back once, then again, and vanished behind the line of firs like it had been swallowed. No crash of branches, no rustle of leaves. Just gone. Erased. I didn't chase it. I didn't even open the door. I stood there, still breathing through my teeth, still trying to understand what part of me didn't want to be afraid. That evening, I went down to the creek to clear my head. I brought Daisy with me and let her off leash. She didn't run far. Just sniffed the air every few feet, circled back to me each time. I found a flat rock and sat, listening to the water slide over stone, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. But there was no logic in it. There was only this strange ache growing in my chest. Pulled towards something I couldn't name. Behind me, I heard a splash. Not a rock. Not a fish. Something heavier. I turned, heart pounding. Nothing. Just ripples curling in the water where something, or someone, had stepped in or stepped out. That night, I lit the fire early. Daisy curled at my feet, asleep but twitching in her dreams. I sat with the old whistle in my hand, turning it over and over, not blowing it. just feeling the grooves of it like braille. The stories Grandpa used to tell. The ones I thought were just campfire nonsense. They weren't nonsense anymore. He used to call the creature Bluey because of a sound it made once, like a foghorn swallowed by fog. I didn't believe him then. But now I could hear that sound again, playing like an echo under my ribs. I whispered the name once, just to the fire. Bluey. And for just a second, I swear, from somewhere out there in the dark, something answered back. After that night in the fog, I couldn't pretend it wasn't real anymore. I didn't know what Bluey was. Man, myth, relic. But he wasn't just a story my grandfather made up to make the woods feel less empty. He was out there and he'd seen me. That part shook me the most. Not just that I'd seen him, but that he'd looked back. There was a difference between being watched and being noticed. He noticed me. I didn't sleep well for the next couple nights. I kept listening for that low, mournful sound. The one that didn't seem to come from lungs so much as from the land itself. But it didn't come again. Not at first. Daisy was on edge too, never straying far from my side, always glancing toward the tree line like she was waiting for something to return. I started leaving scraps out at the edge of the yard. Bits of meat, bruised apples, old cans of beans. Not bait, not exactly. More like an invitation, a peace offering. I didn't expect a reply, but one came. It was small at first. One morning, the food would be gone. But the can would be cleaned out, not torn or crushed like a bear might do. Once, the bones of the meat had been arranged in a near-perfect spiral in the snow. Another time, the apples were gone, and in their place, a stack of flat stones that hadn't been there the night before, balanced perfectly in the shape of a spiral. I started calling him Bluey out loud. At first, only to myself. Then one afternoon, I said it near the tree line while splitting wood. Just said it like it belonged in the air. Bluey. Daisy looked toward the woods. And then I heard it again. That breath sound. That whale call of a sound, rolling through the trees like it had been carried on the back of wind. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I built a fire pit. The earth was hard, half frozen. But I dug out a circle with a pickaxe and lined it with rocks pulled from the creek. I set logs around the outside, just rough-sawn pieces of pine I'd stacked for years, but never used for anything but fuel. I put a bench on one side, a flat stump on the other. It looked like a place meant for company. Not the kind that talks, just the kind that shows up and stays a while. That night, I lit the fire and left a plate by the flames. 1 cooked rabbit, 2 apples, and a wedge of cheese that had started to turn. Then I went back inside and sat by the window with the lantern off, Daisy at my feet. Both of us listening. Hours passed. No sound, no movement. The fire burned down to a low orange core, flickering like it had started to forget its own purpose. Then Daisy's ears twitched. A beat later, I heard it too, sticks shifting, not snapped, just moved, like something with weight was trying not to be heavy. I didn't look out the window right away. I waited. I listened. And then I smelled it. Wet moss, ash, pine sap, and something else. Something old. Something animal, but not wild. When I finally turned my head, I caught him. Not full on, not clearly, but enough. Tall, broad, shaggy. Bent slightly forward like his spine had carried too many winters. He reached down, hand not paw, and picked up the plate. 1 step, then another, back into the trees. He didn't rush, didn't hide. He moved like someone too tired to pretend anymore. I sat back and just let the silence wrap around me. My throat felt tight, like a prayer wanted out but didn't know which god to aim at. Daisy lay down again. Her tail didn't twitch. For the first time in days, she looked at ease. The next morning, the plate was back, washed, not polished, but clean, cleaner than I'd left it. Balanced on the bench with a single pine cone placed in the center like a signature. I picked it up and sat on the bench for the first time. The wood was cold, rough, but solid. I sat there for almost an hour, watching the trees and waiting for something I couldn't name. I didn't get up until the wind shifted. From then on, we started a rhythm. I'd leave food, always simple, things I could spare. He'd take it. Sometimes he'd leave something behind. A carved stick, a smooth rock. Once a feather longer than any bird I'd ever seen up there. Sometimes nothing, but always the sense that he'd been close, that he was choosing to stay near. I started speaking when I was outside, not expecting answers, just sending words into the trees. I told him about the day Mara died, about the letter I never mailed her mother, about the way I sometimes forget how her voice sounded and hate myself for it. I told him about the dream I have, the one where I'm walking into the lake in winter and don't feel the cold. I told him about Eldon, about the fire, about the old whistle and the flower bundle. And when I ran out of things to say, I just sat there in silence. And somehow that was still a conversation. I don't know when it happened exactly, but one night I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the woods, not of him, not of being alone. Bluey never came closer than the trees, never stepped into the light of the fire again. But I could feel him. And in the strangest way, I think he could feel me. There's a kind of grief that gets quieter when someone else carries a piece of it. That's what it felt like he'd taken some of mine and left some of his in its place. And maybe we weren't trying to fix anything. Maybe we were just showing each other the pieces and letting them be seen. But one thing was clear, he was old, not just in years, but in a way that things become when they've lasted past their time. He moved slower each night, left less behind. I started to wonder if he'd come closer not just because he trusted me, but because he was running out of places to go. And I knew then, the way you know a storm before the sky breaks open, that this wouldn't last forever. Something was coming, or maybe something was ending. I kept building the fire, kept waiting by it, and he kept showing up. Just far enough to be shadow, just long enough to be remembered. I started building the bench the same way my grandfather used to build furniture, quietly, without measuring, just working off feel. The fire pit was already there, but I wanted something more permanent for Bluey. Something solid. I carved the edges of the logs with a hunting knife and notched them so they'd lock tight. Didn't use nails. Didn't want anything man-made in it. The final result wasn't pretty, but it held. 2 benches, one facing the other, just off-center from the fire. I left the side closest to the trees empty. I didn't say it out loud, but in my head that seat was his. Daisy seemed to understand. Every evening, when I lit the fire, she'd sit on my side, facing the dark, ears forward, tail tucked low, but not shaking, like she was waiting for something she already trusted. The first night I used the new setup, I brought food. Not scraps this time, something made with purpose. I grilled 3 links of venison sausage over the fire, cut 2 apples in quarters, and stacked it all on a tin plate. I didn't say anything, just set it on the bench across from me and sat back down. The flames danced between us, throwing orange and blue across the snow-packed ground, shadows twisting up the trunks behind. He came, not like before, not from behind a tree or off in the distance. He stepped into the clearing, slow, cautious, like someone stepping into a church they hadn't entered in decades. He didn't look at me right away. His head stayed low, the way an old man lowers himself into a pew with worn knees and something heavier on his shoulders than time. I didn't move. Just let the fire do the talking. Daisy lay flat beside me, watching him without a sound. He sat, not fully, but close. One knee bent, the other leg stretched out stiff in front of him, like it pained him to tuck it under. His hands, not paws, moved with a strange gentleness as he reached for the plate. He sniffed it, then looked across the fire at me for the first time. Not through me, at me. There was something in those eyes I wasn't ready for. Not fear, not wildness, not even sorrow. Recognition. He ate in silence, tearing the sausage in slow bites, the apples gone in too. He left the plate, didn't wipe it or carry it off like before, just left it clean. Then, just as slow as he came, he rose. I watched him disappear into the black. That was the beginning of a rhythm. I'd cook. He'd come. Sometimes he'd eat. Sometimes not. One night, I found the plate untouched, but beside it, 3 pine boughs laid out in a line and a rabbit skull placed neatly in the center. I took it like a message. Not a warning. More like a wordless thank you from someone who didn't have the breath left to say it out loud. It was clear after a week that he wasn't just old. He was fading. His steps grew slower, more uneven. His frame sagged. His shoulders rounded like gravity had gotten personal. There were nights when he didn't come at all. Others when he came and just sat, eating nothing, watching the flames like they held some memory only he could see. I started bringing more food. Soft-cooked rabbit, boiled roots, a pouch of water. He drank it with both hands, like someone who hadn't tasted clean water in months. It broke something in me, watching that. Watching a legend act like a man dying quietly beside a stranger's fire. I started hunting more. Not for sport. Not even for me. For him. Traps, mostly. Snares in the brush. I checked them twice a day. Make sure nothing suffered long. I kept the meat simple. Roasted over the fire. No seasoning. I didn't think he'd care for salt. He always finished it. Every bite. There were moments during those evenings when it didn't feel like I was feeding him. It felt like I was feeding time itself. Like every bite held back the inevitable just one more night. He never spoke. Never gestured. But once, as the snow started falling thick around us, he reached out a hand, not toward me, but toward the fire. He held it there, palm open, letting the heat lick his skin. That was the first time I noticed the scars. Long, puckered lines crossing his forearm and wrist, raised and pale like old rope burns or claw marks. Too many to count, some deep enough that the hair never grew back. I didn't ask what made them. I didn't have to. They weren't the kind of wounds you get from beasts. They were the kind you earn from people. I added another log to the fire that night. Let it burn higher. Let it push back the dark for him a little longer. And he stayed. Longer than usual. Long enough that when he left, the embers were still hot under my boots. Long enough that Daisy had fallen asleep beside me and hadn't even noticed him go. After that, I made a habit of speaking more, not because I expected him to answer, but because something in me needed to be said. I told him about the first time I kissed Mara, the night we lost the baby, the way my mother used to braid my hair when I was little. I told him about the nights I thought about not waking up, and the mornings I resented the sun for trying, and the mornings I resented the sun. I think he understood. Not the words, maybe, but the weight. There was one night. It was colder than most, the fire hissing from melting ice at its base. When he didn't eat, didn't sit, he just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me through the smoke. And then, slowly, he reached into something slung across his back. A pouch made of what looked like stitched hide. He pulled something out and tossed it underhand across the fire. It landed at my feet with a soft thud. It was a photo. Old, faded, water damaged. But I knew it the second I saw it. Me, Mara, and Grandpa Eldon. Taken the summer I turned 10. I thought it burned in the cabin fire decades ago. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The corners were soft, the image blurred, but it was there. Us on the dock. Grandpa's hand on my shoulder. Mara's laugh frozen mid-breath. I looked up, but Bluey was already gone. The fire cracked behind me. But all I heard was the wind shifting through the trees, like breath over an old memory. I held the photo like it might fall apart. And I sat there, knees drawn to my chest, not knowing what to feel, only knowing something in me had shifted again. Something that wasn't coming back the way it was. And in that stillness, with the snow gathering around the benches, with the cold in my fingers, and the warmth of that image pressed to my chest, I finally understood what I'd been doing all along. He wasn't just showing up for food. He was giving me a reason to. It started with a sound. Not the usual low hum I'd come to expect from him, but something else. Quieter, thinner. Almost like a cough carried by the wind. It didn't last long, but it was enough. Daisy's ears pricked, and she looked at me like she wanted me to follow. That was the first time I realized Bluey might not be coming to the fire anymore because he couldn't. Something in my chest pulled tight. I grabbed a flashlight, my coat, and a bag with a few apples and jerky, and followed the direction of the sound into the trees. The trail was barely visible, but it was there. Broken branches, faint drag marks through the snow, disturbed pine needles that caught the light in an odd shimmer. I didn't say his name. I didn't call out. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, deeper than I'd gone in years. The silence got heavier the further I went. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. After nearly an hour of weaving through brush and frozen undergrowth, I found it. A clearing tucked between two rises, shielded on three sides by steep rock, and at the back, almost hidden beneath a curved outcrop of stone and roots, was a shallow cave. Nothing dramatic, no mythic lair. Just a hollow in the earth, dark as a closing eye. I stepped closer and felt something shift in the air. The cold there was different. Not sharper. Older. Like the air had been trapped there for generations, and had only now been let loose. I crouched near the mouth of the cave, not daring to go inside just yet. Daisy stood beside me, tail still, eyes locked on the shadows. She didn't growl, didn't whine, just waited. Inside, I saw the glint of something metallic. I pulled the flashlight from my pocket and flicked it on, the beam cutting into the dark like a knife. What I saw stopped me cold. Lined along the walls, neatly arranged, were objects. Small things, but not random. A cracked Zippo lighter, a rusted horseshoe, a hand-carved pipe, a child's mitten, weathered to the bone, a faded photo of a couple I didn't recognize. And in the far corner, propped against the wall like a sacred relic, was a photograph. My photograph. The same one he'd given back to me at the fire. But this one was older, yellower, bent at the corners like it had been touched 100 times. It was Yus, me, Mara, Grandpa Eldon, on the dock, sun in our eyes, wind in our hair. But this version had a tear through the bottom edge, where my hand used to hold hers. I stepped inside. The ground was dry, covered in layers of pine needles and fur. There was no smell of decay, no filth, just dust and time. Every object in that space felt placed, not stored, revered, as if each piece held a weight beyond its size. These weren't trophies, they were memories, carried, kept, protected. I ran my fingers over the Zippo and turned it in my hand. It still bore the engraving. My grandfather's initials. The same lighter he carried every time we went camping. The one I lost the night he died, when I ran through the woods screaming his name and never looked back. I thought it had vanished with him, but Bluey had found it. Or maybe he'd been there that night. The realization landed slow, heavy. Bluey hadn't just shown up these past few weeks. He'd been there long before. Watching, keeping. I looked around the cave again and understood. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a shrine. And I was standing in the center of something holy. I left the bag of food near the back wall and sat on the ground just outside the mouth of the cave. The cold pressed against my spine, but I didn't care. Daisy curled beside me, her head on her paws, eyes half shut but still alert. The trees above us swayed with a sound like breathing. I closed my eyes and listened. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard him. Not approaching. Already there. When I opened my eyes, he was just beyond the edge of the cave, standing in the trees, half silhouetted by the last orange light bleeding through the branches. He didn't step forward, didn't speak, just stared at me with that same quiet expression I'd come to know. The look of something that had learned to live in silence because the world had never listened. I held up the lighter. He didn't move, but something in his shoulders dropped, like a weight had finally been acknowledged. I set the lighter on a flat stone near the caves, mouth and backed away, not in fear, but in respect. I wasn't here to take, I was here to see and to be seen. That night, back at the cabin, I didn't light the fire. I let the cold settle in. Let it remind me that not all warmth comes from flames. Some of it comes from the knowing that someone, even something you never truly understood, had chosen to hold on to pieces of you long after you'd thrown them away. I kept thinking about the cave, about all the small things that had once been forgotten, things Bluey had carried across miles of wilderness just to keep them close. Not for survival. Not because they were useful, but because they mattered, because they belonged to someone. The next morning, I returned. I brought the whistle. The old one Grandpa gave me when I was 8. The one Bluey had somehow returned to me weeks ago. I left it on the same stone with the lighter. A thank you, maybe, or maybe just a way to say, I remember too. Bluey wasn't there when I arrived. But when I turned to leave, I found a fresh pile of pine needles just outside the entrance, shaped into a crude circle. Centered in it was a small rock, carved, not polished, not precise. Just a simple face, 2 eyes, no mouth, no detail, but unmistakable. It was me. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, hands in my coat pockets, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to climb out and stay behind. I felt something stir in my throat but couldn't name it. Grief, maybe, or peace, or the strange, aching place where both lie side by side. I walked home through the falling snow, Daisy trailing close. The trees whispered around us, not as strangers, but as witnesses. The cabin lights glowed through the fog like a memory you don't quite trust, but follow anyway. And I knew, as I stepped onto the porch, that I'd never see the woods the same way again. Because now I knew what was buried out there. Not just bones, not just time, but pieces of me. And someone had carried them all this way just to give them back. It was the cold that led me there. Not the usual kind, not the quiet bite of winter I'd grown used to. This was something different, heavier. Still. It hung in the air like a breath not taken. For 2 days, Bluey hadn't come to the fire. I left food, water, even lit the logs earlier than usual. Nothing touched. Not even a track in the snow. Daisy waited at the edge of the yard each night, ears high, nose twitching, but she never growled. It was as if she knew too. Knew we were near some kind of end. I packed a bag at sunrise. Canteen, a few strips of meat, matches, shovel. I wasn't sure what I was going out there for. Not exactly. I just knew I didn't want him to be alone. Not if it was happening. Not like this. The woods were still asleep when I stepped off the porch. The trees didn't whisper. The wind didn't push. The world just waited. The trail to the cave was slower this time. Not because of snow or ice, but because I kept hoping I'd hear him. Some sound. Some stirring of branches. Anything. But there was only the rhythm of my boots and Daisy's paws moving through the hush. I found him seated, legs crossed like before, back against the same stone that had held his collection of memory. His arms rested in his lap, palms turned upward, as if he'd just finished holding something. Or someone. His eyes were closed. His breathing shallow, so faint I thought he might have already slipped past. But he hadn't. Not yet. Not yet. I didn't say his name. I don't even know if I thought it. I just sat down beside him, not too close. Close enough that if he wanted to know I was there, he could. I unwrapped the jerky, tore it into small pieces, placed them on a flat stone between us. A tin cup of water beside it. He didn't reach for it, didn't move at all. I sat there for hours, watching the light move across the snow like a slow tide, watching the way his body didn't shift except for the smallest rise and fall of breath. The scars along his arms looked deeper in daylight. Not fresh. Like tree rings, years of pain mapped across the body in silence. Daisy lay behind me, chin on her paws, eyes wide open. Neither of us blinked much. When the sun dipped low and turned the cave mouth gold, I noticed something beside his foot, a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like deer hide, tied with twine. I reached out slowly and unwrapped it. Inside was the photo. The same one. The same exact one. Except now, it was warm. Not from the sun, from his hand. He'd been holding it when he died. I looked up and realized he wasn't breathing anymore. There was no moment. No gasp. No shudder. Just the absence. Just the closing of something quiet and enormous. I sat back, the photo still in my hand, and felt the air thicken. Not from cold, but from grief. A kind I didn't know how to carry. A grief I hadn't earned, but that had been handed to me anyway. The woods didn't move. Nothing cried out. Nothing fell. It was like the forest had already known. It took me until dusk to build the grave. The ground was hard, but not frozen. A mercy. I dug until my back screamed and my hands bled. And even then, I kept going. Daisy stayed close, her breath a mist in the twilight. She didn't whine. She didn't bark. She just watched. When the hole was deep enough, I gathered what I could. A blanket of pine boughs, a circle of stones, one apple, split in half, and the photograph. I didn't bury it with him. I kept it. I couldn't let go of it twice. Laying him down felt sacred. Not religious, not ceremonial. Just sacred. Like folding a flag. Like closing a child's eyes. His body was lighter than I expected, and somehow heavier too. I arranged the pine over him, placed the stones around the edge, not in any pattern, just there. Honest. I lit the last match from my box, struck it against a rock, and held it until it burned too low to hold. And then I sat, I don't know for how long. Long enough for the cold to climb into my bones and settle there. Long enough for my hands to stop trembling. Long enough to know this wasn't the kind of goodbye that fades with time. Before I left, I took the whistle from my coat pocket, the one Grandpa gave me. The one Bluey had returned. I placed it on top of the stones, where the light could still reach it. A closing note, maybe. Or an opening one. The walk home was darker than I expected. Not because of night. Because of weight. Because of what it feels like to know a giant died alone in the woods, and the only thing keeping that from being true was you. Daisy walked beside me, quiet as always. But when we reached the porch, she paused, looked back at the trees. I did too. Nothing moved. Nothing called. But I swear for just a second, the air shifted. Like something had exhaled. Like someone had rested. I stepped inside, sat by the cold fireplace, and held the photo close. The edges were soft now. The ink smudged, but the feeling wasn't. That photo had made a journey none of us had, and it came back. Because he brought it. Because he remembered. Because he chose to. And I think, when it's my time, if I'm lucky, something will remember me that way too. Quiet, full of weight, and never forgotten. It took me weeks to leave the cabin. I don't mean abandon it. I never ever would. But to truly step outside the rhythm I'd fallen into with him. The fire pit stayed cold. The bench by the pines gathered snow in thick layers. The plate I'd used to feed him sat clean but untouched, tucked under the porch like a relic that no longer served its purpose. Daisy would still sit there some evenings, tail curled around her, watching the tree line as if hoping it might move again. I'd sit beside her, but I stopped bringing food. What he needed, I'd already given. And what he gave me couldn't be fed with meat or apples or anything I could carry in my hands. I started spending more time in the woods, not wandering aimlessly, but walking like I belonged, like he'd taught me how. Slow, patient steps, watching the sky through the canopy, reading the hush of the land instead of forcing noise into it. There were places I used to avoid, trails I'd never taken, but now they felt open, not inviting, exactly, just no longer closed off. One afternoon, I hiked out to the ridge above the creek, the one with the bend that catches the last light before sundown. That spot had always reminded me of Mara, something in the shape of the water, the way it curled like her smile. I brought the photograph with me, the one he'd held when he died, and I sat with it in my lap, knees tucked in, coat zipped tight against the wind. I didn't cry. I just remembered. I let it all come through. Her voice, my grandfather's whistle, the sound of blueies breathing beside the fire. And I let it stay. That was the day I decided to write it all down. Not for fame, not for therapy, just so it wouldn't disappear. I bought a small notebook in town, the kind with thick paper and a stitched spine. I started with simple things. What the cave looked like. What the photo smelled like after years of being kept safe. How his hands moved. Not like an animal's, but like someone who used to hold things and forgot how. It turned into more than I expected. Pages became chapters. Memories I thought I'd buried started clawing back to the surface. Not just the strange things, the shadows, the footprints, the gifts, but the human ones too. The night I almost drove off the highway. The morning I held Mara's ring in my palm and felt nothing. The day I stepped out of the hospital with her ashes and didn't know where to go. Somehow, writing it out made space for it to settle. Not disappear, settle. I went into town every few weeks for supplies, and slowly, I stopped avoiding people. I started talking to the older woman at the post office, the kid who ran the gas station, a man named Henry, who used to hunt in those woods back in the 70s, and said he once saw something tall move across the tree line in fog so thick you couldn't see your own breath. He said he never told anyone. I told him I believed him. He didn't laugh. At home, I built something more permanent, not a monument, just a place. I cleared the undergrowth near where I buried him, set 3 stones in the earth, one for him, one for Grandpa, one for Mara. I didn't carve names. I didn't need to. The fire pit nearby still stood, though I never lit it again. I placed the whistle there, the old lighter, and the smooth flat stone that held the shape of my hand perfectly when I sat beside it. And one morning, before the sun broke, I wrote a letter. I wrote it as if I were speaking to the child Mara, and I never had. I told them everything, not just about the creature in the woods, but about loss and silence, and how sometimes the wildest thing you can do is keep going. I told them about kindness that doesn't need language, about grief that doesn't demand to be solved. I told them about how a giant saved me by doing nothing more than sitting near me, night after night, until I remembered how to be alive again. I tucked the letter in the same tin box I used to keep my grandfather's compass, sealed it, and placed it beneath the floorboards of the cabin, just under the hearth. Maybe one day someone will find it. Maybe not. But it's there now, like the rest of this place. Like me. Sometimes, I stand on the porch at night, coffee in hand, Daisy asleep by the door. I look out into the darkness where he used to stand, and I imagine he's still out there somehow. Not in body, but in presence, in the shape of the wind through the branches, in the silence that waits patiently before snowfall, in the stillness that doesn't feel empty, only full of things too big to name. I don't talk to the trees anymore, not the way I used to, but I listen, and when I do, I swear I hear him. Not a voice, not a sound, just something that presses softly against my chest and reminds me that love doesn't always leave footprints. Sometimes it sits across from you at the fire, never saying a word, and lets you fall apart until you're ready to build yourself again. So now I live, not perfectly, Not heroically, just with my eyes open, with my heart less closed. I still have bad days, still wake up with Mara's name in my throat, still dream of that cave, of the moment his breath stopped like it was always supposed to. But I also dream of walking again, of mornings filled with frost and birdsong, of quiet company. He waited for me there. All that time, in silence, in shadow. He waited without asking anything in return. So I'll keep living for him, for her, for the version of myself that sat in the dark and decided not to give up, simply because something in the trees believed I was worth waiting for. And if you're hearing this now, if you've ever felt forgotten or broken or small, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the thing that saves you isn't a miracle. Sometimes it's just a presence. Sometimes it's just someone who stays. Even when the world forgets you, even when you forget yourself, there are stories we hear and stories we carry. And then there are the ones that change us quietly, without warning, without ceremony, because something in them touches a part of us we didn't know was still alive. This was never a story about monsters. It was never about what lurks in the shadows or what walks on two legs in the woods. It was always about the space between us and the things we don't understand. About how sometimes what saves us isn't what we expect. It doesn't always come roaring with light or dressed like hope. Sometimes it comes in silence, in stillness, in the shape of something that simply chooses not to leave. There's something deeply human about the way we search for meaning in the wild. How we listen for voices in the trees, how we look for signs in broken branches or footprints half swallowed by snow. But maybe the meaning doesn't live in what we find. Maybe it lives in the act of looking, in the reaching, in the decision to keep showing up even when no one answers back. This story is about what remains when everything else is stripped away. It's about connection that transcends language, compassion that doesn't need a name, and presence that doesn't demand anything in return. It reminds us that healing doesn't always come from words or reason. Sometimes it comes from simply being seen, fully, without judgment, by something that has no reason to care, and yet chooses to anyway. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, maybe the most sacred thing left is the act of remembering. Remembering what we've lost, yes, but also remembering that even in the loneliest places, we are not truly alone. That kindness can come from the unlikeliest corners. That grace can take a shape we never imagined. So wherever you are right now, whether you're standing in a crowded city or alone in the dark of your own quiet, know this: there is strength in stillness. There is power in presence. And sometimes, the most profound form of love is simply staying close to someone who needs it, without needing to be understood. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.